Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take these huge stacks of sources, articles, research, complex histories, and we boil them all down into the most essential usable knowledge for you.
And today, we are really opening the archives on a man that I think most people know as the father of modern fantasy.
Right. But his life story is just so much more compelling than just, being a successful author. We are talking about John Ronald Reuel Tolkien.
And I think it's crucial right from the start that when you approach Tolkien, you remember you're dealing with a figure whose genius wasn't just imaginative, it was intensely academic.
Yes.
His fictional universe, his legendarium, it wasn't just built on whimsy or arbitrary decisions. It was forged in the fires of high-level scholarship.
Exactly. We all know the storyteller, the master of Middle-earth, but the sources, they just hammer this home again and again. Tolkien was, first and foremost, a professional academic.
I mean, we're talking about some of the most prestigious positions at the University of Oxford.
Right. He held the Rawlinson and Bosworth Professorship of Anglo-Saxon.
That's the one, from 1925 to 1945. And then, after that, he became the Merton Professor of English Language and Literature all the way up to 1959.
That is a towering, serious pedigree. It's not the background of a simple fantasy writer.
And that really is the scaffolding for this entire deep dive. Our mission here is to connect that scholarly pursuit, specifically philology, the deep study of language and its historical context, and connect that directly to his turbulent personal history, his experiences as a soldier in World War I, his profound sense of loss, his deep Catholic faith. These weren't just background details.
Yeah, they were the ingredients.
They were the essential thematic components that shaped Middle-earth and gave it that enduring weight and morality that we all feel when we read it.
So we're really uncovering the foundational philosophy of a world, not just, reading a biography.
Exactly.
And understand that philosophy, we have to start at the beginning. And surprisingly, for an icon of English literature, his origins were, anything but typically English.
That's right. So we jump right into part one, the formative years. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien was born on January 3rd, 1892, in Bloemfontein.
In what was then the Orange Free State in South Africa.
Correct. His father, Arthur Reuel Tolkien, had moved there to take a position as a bank manager.
But that chapter, that African chapter of his life, it was tragically brief. It led to a defining early loss for him.
Very brief. When Ronald was just 3 years old, he traveled back to England with his mother, Mabel, and his younger brother, Hilary. It was only supposed to be a temporary visit.
But his father never joined them.
No. Arthur Tolkien died unexpectedly back in South Africa from acute rheumatic fever before he could get back to them. So suddenly, Mabel and the two little boys were basically stranded in England.
And completely stripped of their financial security.
Completely.
Yeah.
That immediately changed their entire trajectory. They eventually settled near Birmingham in King's Heath, and then, crucially, they moved to the rural Worcestershire village of Sarehole.
And this is where it all starts. This is where you can literally see the landscape of Middle-earth beginning to form.
Sarehole was essential. I mean, we are talking about places like Sarehole Mill, Moseley Bog, the Clint and Lickey Hills.
Well, these weren't just places he played as a kid.
No. They are directly referenced and sort of stylized in his fiction. For instance, his Aunt Jane's farm. It was actually named Bag End.
That's the ultimate example, isn't it? Reality just bleeding directly into fantasy. It's a remarkable detail, grounding maybe the most famous fictional home in the real world.
It is. This physical landscape, this simple, idyllic English countryside, would become the Shire. It becomes the place that is worth defending above all else.
And it just underscores how deeply connected his imaginary world was to that physical nostalgia of his childhood.
Absolutely. And speaking of childhood, our sources really stress the monumental role his mother, Mabel, played in his early education and, critically, his faith.
She was a woman of fierce intellect, from what I've read.
And dedication. She taught him entirely at home, and he was clearly a prodigious student, a precocious kid. He could read by age 4, write fluently soon after.
You got into languages early, right?
That was very early. She taught him the basics of Latin. He developed a strong interest in botany, and he even started inventing his own sort of private language games with his cousins before he was even 10.
But the most significant, the most definitive aspect of Mabel's life, and therefore Ronald's, was her conversion to Roman Catholicism in 1900.
And that was a seismic event. In that rigid Protestant Edwardian society, it was a huge deal. Her wealthy Baptist family, they were outraged.
And they cut her off.
Completely. They cut off all financial assistance. They basically chose their faith over their own kin, and this left the family in extreme poverty and, social isolation.
That sacrifice, both financial and social, must have taught the young Tolkien a very, very harsh lesson about conviction.
I think it was pivotal. And then just 4 years later, in 1904, Mabel died of acute diabetes. She was only 34.
And this was decades before insulin.
Decades. So she just survived as long as she could manage without treatment, all while struggling to raise her 2 boys and maintain her faith. It's no wonder Tolkien later referred to his mother as a martyr.
A martyr for the faith that she instilled in him.
Precisely. He wrote that she, and I'm quoting here, killed herself with labor and trouble to ensure us keeping the faith. This is the bedrock of his lifelong commitment.
And his guardian, Father Francis Xavier Morgan, he reinforced that structure.
He did.
Right.
He was from the Birmingham Oratory, and he taught Tolkien about charity and forgiveness. So these themes, religious commitment, sacrifice, the profound moral stakes of life, they are just foundational to the adult Tolkien and really to the entire moral structure of Middle-earth.
Now, before World War I casts its long shadow, we have to talk about his early romance, because it sounds like something straight out of one of his own epic tales.
It really does. His courtship with Edith Mary Bratt, their story is legendary.
He met her when he was just 16.
In 1908, she was 3 years older than him, and they were both orphans living in the same boarding house in Edgbaston. They fell into this deep, intense bond very quickly.
And they were kind of mischievous together, weren't they?
Oh, yeah, they had these rebellious little antics, like throwing sugar lumps into the hats of people passing by from a tier room balcony. Just kids in love.
They were inseparable. But then came the roadblock. Father Morgan intervened.
He did. Father Morgan was very concerned about the intensity of the relationship, especially with an older Protestant woman. He was worried it was distracting Tolkien from his studies.
Right, he thought it was why Tolkien muffed his scholarship exams for Oxford.
Exactly. So the injunction was severe. Morgan strictly prohibited Tolkien from meeting, talking to, or even writing to Edith until he turned 21.
That is a 5-year banishment from the person he loved most. And the sources make it clear that Tolkien, despite the emotional pain, he obeyed that injunction almost to the letter.
It's a crucial insight into his character, that sense of duty. He honored the commitment, but the very moment he turned 21 on January 3rd, 1913, he acted. Instantly.
He wrote her a letter.
A fervent letter declaring he'd never stopped loving her and proposing marriage.
And the reply he got back must have been a shock.
A huge shock. She replied that she had already accepted another man's proposal. She thought Tolkien had just forgotten her after 5 years of total silence.
But he didn't give up.
Not for a second. He got on a train to Cheltenham, where she was living, found her, and after this long, intense walk and talk, famously under a railway viaduct, a scene that just belongs in a movie,
She agreed.
she agreed to marry him and returned her engagement ring.
What incredible resilience. But there was a condition for the marriage, wasn't there? One set by Tolkien.
Yes. It was non-negotiable for him, rooted in the sacrifice his mother had made. Edith had to convert to Catholicism.
Well, she did.
Reluctantly, but yeah, she converted in January 1916. They were married that March. And that devotion, all those immense obstacles they overcame, that becomes the real-life source material for the great elven mortal love story that forms the spine of his entire mythology.
And just months after their wedding, the shadow of the First World War finally engulfs them.
Yes. Tolkien finally enlists. And our sources do note his controversial decision to delay enlisting until he finished his degree. He endured a lot of public obloquy for that.
Yeah, that was a tough position to be in.
Extremely tough. He wrote in a letter, much later, that in those days chaps joined up or were scorned publicly. He saw delaying as the only way to secure his education and his future. He finished with first-class honors in 1915 and was quickly commissioned as a temporary second lieutenant.
In the Lancashire Fusiliers.
That's right. He trained for almost a year, and right before he's sent into the fray, you can see his anti-authoritarian philosophy really start to germinate.
This is a remarkable foreshadowing of his fictional themes.
It really is. He was commanding enlisted men who were predominantly working-class Tommies from Lancashire towns, and he felt this deep affinity for them, but military protocol strictly forbade officers from being friends with the other ranks.
And he hated that. He chafed against that arbitrary hierarchy.
He didn't just chafe. He rejected the whole premise of command. He lamented that, quote, "the most improper job of any man is bossing other men.
Wow.
Not one in a million is fit for it, and least of all those who seek the opportunity." This profound skepticism of centralized power and the corrupting nature of authority was forged right before he was thrown into the crucible of the Somme.
That sentiment, that distrust of the boss, is the moral DNA of his work. So he was posted to France in June 1916.
Right, just in time to participate in some of the most horrific battles of the entire war. He joined the line near Amiens and took part in these savage, grinding assaults on major German defenses.
Like the Schwaben Redoubt and the Leipzig salient?
Exactly. He was a battalion signals officer, which meant he was constantly moving messages through incredibly dangerous territory.
The historical records of the trenches are vivid, but the details of the conditions he faced, they're almost unimaginable today.
Horrific, especially the diseases that just spread like wildfire through the muck and the congestion. The Anglican chaplain to his unit recorded that officers were being eaten by hordes of lice that transmitted trench fever.
Their only way to get clean was to boil their uniforms.
Right, and that biological warfare, if you can call it that, is exactly what ended up saving his life.
Ironically, yes.
On October 27, 1916, as his battalion was attacking a position called Regina Trench, Tolkien contracted trench fever. He was immediately invalided back to England on November 8th.
And the timing was crucial.
Absolutely crucial. While he was recovering for months, medically unfit for service, his battalion was almost completely wiped out.
So his physical survival came at this terrible emotional cost, specifically the loss of his literary circle, the TCBS.
The Tea Club in Barovian Society. It was this intense group he'd formed with his friends Rob Gilson, Geoffrey Bashmith, and Christopher Wiseman. They were dedicated to writing, to fostering each other's poetry.
And the war just shattered them.
Gilson was killed on the very first day of the Somme. Smith was killed when a German shell hit a first aid post. So Tolkien survived, but the fellowship of his youth was destroyed.
He returned home only to realize that of the 4 core members, only he and Christopher Wiseman were left.
It's just devastating. And that trauma, it taught him a deep sympathy and feeling for the Tommy, especially the plain soldier. It cemented the themes of loss, the destruction of a golden age, and the fragility of fellowship that just pervade his mythology. It gives us the emotional landscape of Mordor.
But even amidst all this loss, while he was recovering, he got the spark for the most famous love story in his entire creation, the Lúthien anecdote.
This is really the poetic climax of his personal life. While he was recovering from trench fever, he was briefly stationed at the Humber garrison near Roos in Yorkshire, and his wife, Edith, was able to live with him for a while.
And one day, in a clearing of flowering hemlock, she danced for him.
She did. Scholars think it was probably cow parsley or wild carrot, but the image is the same. That moment in 1917, seeing his wife dance in the sunlight among the flowers, was this moment of profound, spontaneous beauty that just transcended the ongoing tragedy of the war.
He wrote about it later.
He wrote that he never called Edith Lúthien, but she was the source of the story that in time became the chief part of the Silmarillion. It was a moment of grace, of enduring life in the face of so much death.
And that event was immortalized right on their tombstone.
Indeed. It became such a profound central connection that after Edith died in 1971, he had the name Lúthien engraved on her tombstone, and when he died 21 months later, Beren was added to his name.
So the central love story of his mythology is literally inscribed in his real history.
It confirms that his fiction was merely a frame for his most cherished memories.
It's so clear that everything he cherished and everything he lost just became foundational. So let's now transition into part 2 and look at the scholarly engine that allowed him to express all this, the linguist's craft, how philology literally became fantasy.
This is where we really understand that Tolkien's literary output isn't just related to his academic career, it is fundamentally inseparable from it. His first civilian job after the war was working on the massive Oxford English Dictionary.
The OED. That sounds like a highly meticulous job that would require obsessive attention to detail.
It was. He worked mainly on the history and etymology of Germanic words, starting with the letter W. He actually admitted to struggling mightily with the entry for walrus.
So he's tracing the historical journey of words.
Exactly. Where they came from, how they changed, what cultural baggage they carried. That is the essence of philology.
And from the OED, he very quickly transitioned into a professorship. He was obviously brilliant.
By 1920, he was a reader in English language at the University of Leeds. He was the youngest member of the academic staff, and he was promoted to full professor by 1924.
And he was an engaging teacher, right? Not some dry academic.
Apparently very engaging. He even boasted that he'd increased the number of Germanic philology students from 5 to 20, and they went on to form a boisterous Viking club.
So what exactly was he teaching that captivated these students? What was on the syllabus?
He taught an immense array of subjects that really formed the linguistic backbone of Middle-earth. We're talking Old English, heroic verse, Gothic, Old Icelandic, Middle English texts, introductory Germanic philology, medieval Welsh.
Wow.
He specialized in English philology and Old Norse, and he had a particular, no, he said imperfect knowledge of Finnish, which would become one of the crucial ingredients for his invented languages.
So his passion wasn't just English language. It was this whole ancient world of Northern European linguistic history.
Precisely. For Tolkien, language wasn't just communication, it was archaeology. Every word carried the weight of history, myth, and culture. His focus was always on the relationship between language and the people who spoke it.
And it was this specialization that led to his greatest single academic contribution, the 1936 lecture, Beowulf, The Monsters and the Critics.
This lecture is widely seen as a major turning point in Beowulf scholarship. It completely redefined how the poem was read.
Before Tolkien, scholars pretty much dismissed it, right?
Yeah.
They did. They were antiquarians. They read the poem for its linguistic history or used it as a source of cultural facts about, early Anglo-Saxon society.
And they dismissed the battles with Grendel and the dragon as just childish, distracting elements.
They saw the fantasy as a flaw. They wanted realistic tribal warfare, not monsters. But Tolkien argued the exact opposite. He established the primacy of the poem as art, as dramatic poetry.
What was the essence of his revolutionary argument?
He argued that the monster battles were, in fact, the most essential part of the poem. The author wasn't just addressing tribal politics, he was addressing universal human destiny, fate, mortality.
So Grendel and the dragon represented the eternal struggle against chaos and death.
Exactly. By centering the monsters, Tolkien lifted Beowulf out of the dusty archives of linguistics and into the realm of profound dramatic literature.
That is the moment where the philologist finds the mythology he needs to create. He even said Beowulf was among my most valued sources.
And this academic triumph was delivered with incredible dramatic flair. This is one of the most memorable details of his academic life.
Tell us the anecdote. It's fantastic.
His biographer, Humphrey Carpenter, noted that Tolkien would start his lecture series not with notes, but by silently entering the room, surveying the students, and then suddenly declaiming the opening lines of Beowulf in the original Old English.
It's booming it out,
He would burst out with a great cry of wheat.
which is Old English for listen or hark.
Right. It was this sudden dramatic performance, forcing the students to hear the poem as living, powerful, dramatic art.
And that's why W.H. Auden wrote to him decades later.
Yes. The poet W.H. Auden thanked him for the unforgettable experience, and I'm quoting here, saying, "The voice was the voice of Gandalf." It's just an amazing crystallization of the academic and the myth maker being one and the same person.
So the foundation of Middle-earth wasn't a plot idea. It was language. Our source material stresses this over and over. He was inventing worlds just to give his languages a home.
That is the defining insight into Tolkien. His philosophy was radical. He believed that language construction should breed a mythology. He wasn't like modern authors who invent a few placeholder words. For him, the language was the primary artistic creation.
So what did he mean by prioritizing aesthetics and euphony?
It means he felt that the beauty and pleasantness of sound, the phonesthetic considerations, had to come first. Only then could a believable culture and history and mythology naturally follow.
So if he liked the sound of a certain consonant cluster,
He would invent a history for a people whose vocal habits produce those sounds. It's completely backwards from how most people write.
and this led to his most famous linguistic creations, especially the Elvish languages.
Yes, Quenya, which is High Elvish, and Sindarin. Quenya, in particular, was driven purely by those phonesthetic considerations. He based its phonology on Latin, with crucial influences from Welsh, English, Greek, and most importantly, Finnish.
Finnish is a very specific choice, very different from the Germanic traditions he usually studied. Why Finnish?
Finnish offered a structure that Tolkien found profoundly beautiful. It's an agglutinative language.
Which means?
It means words are formed by gluing together long strings of prefixes and suffixes to express complex meanings. It results in these very long, rolling words with rich vowel sounds. He wanted Quenya to be melodious, almost operatic. He called it elven Latin, a formal, preserved language, much like Latin was to medieval Europe.
So Quenya is beautiful and formal. What about Sindarin?
Sindarin was based more on Welsh phonologically, with its mutations and complex consonant sounds. That was designed to be the more mutable, everyday language of the elves, the language that changed over time, reflecting the real history of language evolution.
So he's not just creating languages, he's creating linguistic histories.
He is, and he believed that if a language didn't have a myth, it was dead. He was very skeptical of constructed languages like Esperanto. He said their authors never invented any Esperanto legends.
So for him, if a language lacked the historical and cultural weight of stories, it was far deader than ancient unused languages.
Language and myth were two sides of the same coin. Absolutely.
That deep commitment to language explains why his world feels so vast and layered. It was literally built from the ground up, starting with grammar. So let's move into part 3. Building the Legendarium. By 1925, Tolkien is back at Oxford, and he's writing his major works.
And while he's at Oxford, first as a professor at Pembroke College, he becomes a key figure in this informal literary discussion group called the Inklings.
And the importance of this group, especially his close friendship with C.S. Lewis, you really can't overstate it.
You can't. They weren't just drinking buddies, they were intellectual sparring partners. Lewis was often the pragmatic, classical counterweight to Tolkien's romantic, philological views.
And he was a critical sounding board.
Constantly. Lewis provided constant support while Tolkien was writing The Lord of the Rings, listening to chapters read aloud, and giving sometimes harsh but always crucial critique. They were essential to each other's creative process.
During this time, The Hobbit emerges as this kind of accidental success. It was written purely for his children.
Entirely. He'd been creating fantasy stories for his kids for years, including those highly illustrated annual Christmas letters that were supposed to be from Father Christmas. The Hobbit was written over many years and only came to the attention of publishers by sheer accident.
A chance recommendation in 1936.
That's right. An employee at George Allen and Unwin named Susan Dagnall read the manuscript. The publisher, Stanley Unwin, wisely gave it to his 10-year-old son, Rayner, to review.
And Rayner loved it.
He did. The book attracted both kids and adults, and the publisher immediately asked for a sequel.
And that request led directly to The Lord of the Rings, which took him over a decade to complete.
It was a monumental undertaking. He originally thought he'd write another light, simple children's story, but it quickly evolved into something much darker, much more serious.
Because he started drawing on that immense, complex backstory he'd been building for years.
Yeah.
His Legendarium.
Right. It was a serious effort, consuming most of his available time during the war and post-war years. He finished the primary narrative around 1948, but the publishing process itself was complex.
Printing costs in post-WWII Britain were high.
Very high. So the massive novel had to be published in 3 separate volumes between 1954 and 1955.
And the popularity was not just immense, it was culturally transformative. It really established him as the father of high fantasy.
The success was astronomical, especially in the 1960s when the paperbacks hit the U.S. market. It became a genuine cult phenomenon on university campuses.
We can quantify this fame.
Oh, yeah. In the 2003 BBC Big Read survey, it was voted the UK's best-loved novel. Amazon customers judged it their favorite book of the millennium in 1999. It didn't just sell well, it created a genre.
But Tolkien himself always considered his central epic, the Silmarillion, the true core of his mythology.
He did. The Silmarillion was the spine of it all. An epic history of the Elder Days, starting with the creation of the world.
And he started it multiple times, but just never managed to finish or publish it in his lifetime.
He desperately hoped to publish it alongside The Lord of the Rings, but the publishers declined. They saw it as too complex, too esoteric, just too commercially risky.
But this material, it contained deeper connections to classical myth, which he loved, like the Atlantis legend.
Yes. From around 1936, he worked on the tragic tale of the fall of Numenor, the great western island that was swallowed by the sea. He consciously based this on the myth of Atlantis. He also wrote other substantial, lesser-known works, like retellings of the Germanic legend of Sigurd and Gudrun.
Always interacting with those classical northern myths.
Yeah.
But the publication of the bulk of his mythology, it relied entirely on the decades-long dedication of his son, Christopher Tolkien.
Christopher was his father's literary executor, and he faced this immense task of organizing decades of contradictory, abandoned, messy drafts.
He compiled the Silmarillion, which was published posthumously in 1977.
And that book provided the epic history that readers had been waiting for, but that was only the tip of the iceberg.
Right, because then came the 12 comprehensive volumes, The History of Middle-earth.
And those 12 volumes really show the sheer scope of his work. They track the evolution of the stories and languages over time.
And they really emphasize how fluid and unfinished Tolkien considered his entire creation.
That is the essential insight. These materials contain unfinished, abandoned, alternative, and often wildly contradictory accounts because they were always a work in progress for him. He was a fastidious perfectionist.
And he rarely settled on a definitive version of any given tale. He was constantly refining the linguistic and historical tapestry.
He was so committed to that refinement that he even said years later that he would have preferred to rewrite The Hobbit completely because of its earlier, lighter prose style.
It just shows his perpetual commitment to his own internal canon. His goal wasn't a fixed, singular text, but a living, evolving linguistic history that felt real.
Exactly.
Before we move on to his philosophy, we have to briefly acknowledge his versatility as an artist.
We mentioned his children's books, like Mr. Bliss and Roverandom, and those Father Christmas letters weren't just stories. They were elaborately illustrated works of art he sent to his kids every year.
He was a skilled visual artist.
He was. He produced the cover art, the maps, and numerous illustrations for the early editions of his published works, including The Hobbit and the maps for The Lord of the Rings. A true polymath.
A scholar who synthesizes history, language, illustration, and narrative into a single, cohesive world. Okay, let's transition into part 4. We need to explore the philosophical compass that guided all of this. His views on religion, power, race, and nature.
We absolutely have to start with the sanctifying myth of his deep Catholicism. It was a cornerstone of his existence, inherited from his mother's sacrifice, and it deeply influenced his worldview.
We know he and C.S. Lewis had many intense discussions about faith, and Tolkien's beliefs were a significant factor in Lewis's famous conversion from atheism to Christianity.
Tolkien had a very clear, devout view of the purpose of life. He wrote that it was, quote, to increase according to our capacity our knowledge of God by all the means we have, and to be moved by it to praise and thanks.
And he had a special devotion to the Blessed Sacrament.
He did. He wrote this deeply personal advice to his son Michael, telling him that in Holy Communion you will find romance, glory, honor, fidelity, and the true way of all your loves upon earth.
So for him, religious commitment was the highest form of loyalty and duty?
It was. He strongly encouraged frequent reception of Holy Communion as the only cure for sagging of fainting faith.
His faith was so intertwined with language that he even resisted liturgical changes within the church later in life.
That's a perfect example of his integrated identity. He resisted some of the changes after the Second Vatican Council, primarily because he objected to the use of clumsy, literal English translations for the Mass.
He spoke Latin fluently.
So he would often just continue to make the Mass responses in fluent Latin, preferring the precision and historical weight of the ancient language over what he saw as awkward modern vernacular.
And the most provocative detail from our sources is the movement toward possible sainthood for him.
The recognition of his profound spiritual life is serious. In 2017, the Oxford Oratory, which was Tolkien's parish church, offered its first Mass with the explicit intention of opening Tolkien's cause for beatification.
A necessary step toward possible sainthood.
It just underscores how exemplary his faith was perceived to be.
And that strong moral grounding connects directly to his fiercely individual political philosophy.
No.
His deep skepticism of authority. He described his political leanings as moving more and more to anarchy.
And we really need to clarify what he meant by anarchy. He specified he meant anarchy.
He saw it as inherently dangerous and corrupting, regardless of who held it.
Exactly. Essentially, he believed that no human being was fit to rule others.
And we're back to that quote, forged in the trenches.
Yes. The most improper job of any man is bossing other men. Not one in a million is fit for it, and least of all those who seek the opportunity. He saw humility and service as virtues that were just constantly eroded by political ambition.
So if that is his philosophical conviction, what does this mean for the epic he wrote? How does that philosophical anarchism play out?
It is the central engine of The Lord of the Rings. His conviction was that power itself inherently corrupts. The One Ring isn't just a weapon, it is the ultimate expression of centralized, dominating power, the temptation to boss other men.
And this explains the core moral choices of the story.
It perfectly explains them. It's why Gandalf rejects the ring outright, fearing that even if he used it with the best intentions, its nature would inevitably corrupt him into a dark, dominating force.
It's why the ring has to be destroyed, not used.
Exactly. The desire to dominate and control others is the core temptation of evil in Middle-earth, embodied by Sauron and Saruman alike.
That dramatically reframes the quest. It's not just a journey to destroy an object. It's a philosophical treatise on governance. We also need to address the scholarly discussion around race and what some call moral geography in his work.
This is a complex area that scholars continue to debate, and it requires careful, impartial reporting.
In his personal life, he was demonstrably anti-racist.
Oh, yes. Famously opposing Nazi racial theories in a 1938 letter, and refusing to support anti-German propaganda during World War II.
However, critics and scholars analyzing the text have noted certain literary tropes that require examination.
They have. Critics point out that his work sometimes embodies Victorian literary attitudes towards race and relies on medieval literature that often define enemies as monstrous or other. Specifically, the issue of moral geography comes up a lot.
What does that term moral geography imply in the context of Middle-earth?
It refers to the observation that goodness is often associated with the West, the elves, the Shire and evil, with the East and South Mordor, the Haradrim, the Easterlings.
And some critics argue that the narrative implies a hierarchy or a concern with race mixing and moral decline.
Right. They suggest these elements might echo scientific racism that was present in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
But this viewpoint is not universally accepted. Many scholars offer a robust defense of the work's cultural complexity.
Not at all. Many scholars argue that Middle-earth is polycultural and polylingual in its very essence. They defend the work by pointing out that critics often omit important textual evidence, like the mixed ancestries of major heroes like Aragorn.
So it's a debate between reading the text as a product of its time versus reading it as a profoundly intentional philological exercise.
Exactly. The defense emphasizes that evil is defined by a philosophical choice, the desire for domination, not an inherent racial trait, and that his personal life confirmed his distaste for racial theory. Our job is simply to report impartially on the existence of this sophisticated scholarly debate.
Moving from the political to the natural world, what were his environmental views? We know his beloved childhood landscape, Sarahole, became the Shire.
His personal fondness for forests and nature was profound. In private letters, he expressed deep sadness and distress over industrial development and tree felling.
And literary analyses of The Lord of the Rings suggest that his writing process really amplified his interest in protecting wild, untamed nature from industrialization.
It did. The constant struggle between the simple, agrarian, natural life of the Shire and the destructive, mechanical hunger for power represented by Saruman's industrial hellscape at Isengard and the pits of Mordor is central.
But the most direct expression of this is the scouring of the Shire.
Yes, where the hobbits return home only to find their idyllic world has been industrialized and corrupted by Saruman's lackeys.
That scene, which a lot of the film adaptations gloss over, is actually the ultimate climax of his philosophical rejection of industrialized power encroaching on the simple, natural life.
It is the ultimate confrontation between the rural idyll he cherished as a boy and the urban sprawl he witnessed overtaking Sarahole. The entire battle is essentially a moral and environmental statement.
Okay, let's look at part 5. The immense global legacy of this reluctant celebrity. After he retired in 1959, his literary fame just exploded.
It increased steadily until his death in 1973. The sales were so substantial that he often said he regretted not choosing early retirement, but that popularity came with an immense personal cost.
Relentless fan attention.
It grew so intense that he had to take his phone number out of the public directory. Students and fans would constantly bother him. He eventually moved with Edith to the seaside resort of Bournemouth in 1968, in large part to escape that relentless attention.
Which was, ironically, the ultimate anti-Hobbit move, moving to a flashy seaside town.
It was. But he did it for Edith. While he missed his friends from the Inklings, Edith was reportedly overjoyed by the move, finally stepping into a role as a society hostess.
And after Edith passed away in 1971, Tolkien returned to Oxford.
He did. Merton College gave him rooms near the High Street, and in his final years, he received the highest honors.
He was made a Commander of the Order of the British Empire, a CBE.
In the 1972 New Year honors, receiving the insignia from the Queen herself. That same year, Oxford University granted him an honorary doctorate of letters.
He died 21 months after Edith, in September 1973, at the age of 81. And we return for the last time, to the most poignant memorial of his life, his grave.
He was buried next to Edith in Wolvercote Cemetery, and as we noted, the inscription confirms their connection to the legendarium with the name Lúthien on her tombstone, and Beren added to his. It's a silent, beautiful testament to the real-life source of his central love story.
His literary influence wasn't just contained to books and gravestones. It fundamentally shaped the entire modern fantasy genre.
The tremendous success of his books caused this popular resurgence in fantasy literature, and most importantly, it defined the entire high fantasy genre. It set the standards for world building and scope.
Every subsequent author in the genre, from Ursula K. Le Guin to George R.R. Martin, has had to reckon with his legacy.
Absolutely. The scholar Tom Shippey called Tolkien the author of the 20th century for this very impact.
And that influence extended into adaptations almost immediately. He sold the film, stage, and merchandise rights to The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings in 1968.
Which opened the floodgates. We had the animated versions, like the Ralph Bakshi film in '78, and the Rankin-Bass TV films, and then, of course, the monumental Peter Jackson film trilogies in the early 2000s, which redefined fantasy cinema entirely.
And the appetite remains boundless.
The Jackson films were astronomical successes, winning numerous Oscars, which only fueled further expansion. The Amazon television series, The Rings of Power, new animated projects like The War of the Rohirrim. Middle-earth is now a permanent fixture in global popular culture.
And the world's memorials and eponyms dedicated to his work really drive home how global his impact is. It goes beyond just plaques and museums.
Oh, absolutely. His creations are literally mapped onto the Earth and the solar system. We find Canadian mountains named Mount Gandalf, Mount Shadowfax, and Mount Aragorn.
And even on Saturn's moon, Titan.
Most wonderfully, yes. Geographical features on Titan are officially named after characters and places from his works, from mountains to craters.
So, as we reach the end of this deep dive, we've covered the scholar, the soldier, the linguist, and the devout man. What does this synthesis tell us about his enduring mythology?
The key takeaway is synthesis itself. Tolkien's mythology is not whimsical escapism. It is a direct, unavoidable product of rigorous academic labor, the philologist's craft, combined with profound personal trauma and a clearly defined moral framework.
A framework rooted in faith and a deep skepticism of power.
Exactly. The sheer volume of his creation, his legendarium, demonstrates that the languages, the history, the monsters, and the critics, they were all connected elements of a single coherent vision.
The moral compass, forged in the WWI trenches, his deep faith and that skepticism of power is the core theme. The ring is the ultimate expression of the improper job of bossing other men.
Every key event in his life informs the fiction. His experiences at the Somme inform the landscape of Mordor and the theme of inevitable loss. His early life in Sarehole became the idyllic shire that must be defended.
And his eternal hard-won love for Edith became the epic central tale of Beren and Lúthien.
The mythology is built on everything he cherished, defended, and lost.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? What's the final provocative thought to leave you with now that you know the depth of this creation?
Well, we spent time detailing Christopher Tolkien's immense work in compiling the history, those 12 volumes of contradictory, unfinished drafts, and the final provocative thought is this. Tolkien's world remains infinitely rich and open to interpretation precisely because he himself considered it a perpetual work in progress.
He was never satisfied.
Never. He was constantly revising languages, timelines, and narratives. So you should consider Middle-earth not as a fixed, finished narrative, but as a living, evolving linguistic tapestry, a lifetime's conversation that was never meant to be fully finalized. It's constantly inviting new layers of discovery and debate. It is the unfinished history of a man who loved language too much to ever let it settle into silence.